I'm Ed Adams, and this is the weekly Genealogy Toolkit, the podcast that helps new genealogists get the most out of their research time and avoid the most common pitfalls. Immigration is a commonly tackled topic within genealogical circles because it's a common challenge to contend with. There are very few people who, after building out their family tree to a decent degree, haven't uncovered an immigrant or two. According to the Cato Institute, over 86 million people have legally immigrated into the United States since 1783. So, for Americans, virtually all of us have an immigrant or 100 back in there somewhere. It's an exciting area for research because many of us have a desire to build a cohesive picture of who we are, and that will usually involve discovering where we're from. The immigrants in my family have always been of interest to me, also because of the process of walking away from an entire identity and the support structure of a known environment for the chaos and confusion of a new one, and it's foreign and interesting to me. I've grown up quite privileged to be an American. I'm not making any sort of statement here other than just to say that of all the places I could have been born, I was born in a pretty good place. It's never occurred to me to give up being an American to go try and be something else. The immense pressures at play to cause someone to make the decision to immigrate are interesting to me, and I'm always trying to figure out why. Although that's one of the harder answers to obtain genealogically. Depending on when your ancestor immigrated to the United States, any answer about the act of immigration might be challenging to obtain. There is a well-developed image of the traditional immigrant within the United States. While more recently the term probably conjures up images of families with nothing but what they have on their backs, either swimming across rivers or climbing over fences to then disappear into the inhospitable desert terrain of the American Southwest. More broadly speaking, the term immigrant more likely conjures up images of ocean liners arriving in New York Harbor and being in-processed at Ellis Island. While that's certainly an image of immigration in the United States, it's really only a snapshot. Now, I'm not going to be talking about immigration that occurred before, say, 12,000 years ago, but even looking at a smaller window of, say, 1600 to the present, there have been several eras or waves of immigration, each of which left different records that have been collected in different ways. So today I want to talk broadly about one of those waves and some records that you can use to try to answer some of those questions that you're going to have. You might say that the first wave of immigrants to North America started in 1585 with the colony of Roanoke. This wave lasted quite some time, and while there were sort of micro waves within this massive movement of people from Europe to North America, for the purpose of today's episode, let's say it lasted till about 1840. I'm sure there's a name for this wave among scholars of American immigration, but I'll just call it the Colonial and Federal wave. Broadly speaking, Massachusetts and the areas in the Northeast saw immigration mostly from English Puritans from East Anglia, which is that sort of roundish nubbin poking out to the northeast of London. The Delaware Valley was full of Quakers from the northern Midlands and areas along a band running south of Sheffield and north of Nottingham. The mid-Atlantic colonies like Virginia saw an influx of moneyed Cavaliers from the south of England, and the collective backcountry, which ran from the western parts of Pennsylvania on down to northeast Georgia, saw immigrants from a wide variety of places throughout Europe, but later in the colonial period became dominated by the Scots-Irish and other borderlanders. That is, of course, broadly speaking. There were, of course, loads of German-speaking peoples and quite a few French speakers as well who arrived during that time. I'll pause here to address the fact that I'm not really going to be addressing the timelines, origins, or spread of Africans through the colonies, because I don't think it's fair to call them immigrants. I think the term implies at least a partially voluntary trip with a certain degree of agency that doesn't really apply to those who were enslaved and brought here against their will. That might be something we look at more closely in a separate episode. As for the German speakers who came during this time, they came from all over Central Europe, really, from Switzerland to the west to Bohemia and the northern coast of Poland to the east. They were called German, Dutch, Moravian, Mennonite. Almost all were Protestant. While they settled predominantly throughout the Pennsylvania colony, there are notable pockets of German immigration throughout. There's a part of South Carolina still today called the Dutch Fork, named for the large population of Germans who settled there. The early French speakers came from a number of places. Well, I suppose ultimately they all came from France, but they didn't all get a direct flight, if you will. The first wave of French came before 1700 with the Huguenots, French Protestants fleeing persecution. Another group of French immigrants came slightly later to eastern Canada, predominantly Quebec and Acadia. Those that settled in Acadia were forcibly moved as a result of the French and Indian War, with many of them ending up along the western portions of the Gulf Coast, and we now know them as Cajuns today. There were other groups of French immigrants, namely after the Revolution, but few ended up in North America. While Canada was the primary destination for most French speakers, many did slowly trickle down south over time, as the pull of a growing economy made the British colonies seem slightly more attractive. French settlement was focused in two main areas: Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut to the north, and South Carolina in the south. There is today, in fact, a beautiful French Huguenot church in downtown Charleston. Now, there were, of course, a wide variety of other people who immigrated during this period, from Jews to Spaniards, from Poles to even a few Asians, but these came in very small numbers comparatively. But regardless where they came from, how can you track these immigrants down today? There was no Ellis Island, right? Absolutely not. Not only was there no Ellis Island, but with 13 colonies, there were effectively 13 different ways of handling immigration. Unlike with Ellis Island, where you can easily search ship manifests, it's not quite that simple with Colonial and Federal Era immigration. There are shockingly few ship manifests, partly because some of them have been lost to time, but mostly because it wasn't really a requirement for them to even be produced. In some cases, where the ship's captain was being paid by a third party to transport immigrants, there would be something resembling a manifest as it was part of the overall business transaction, but in most cases where the immigrants themselves or their families or a benefactor paid for their trip up front, there was no reason to keep a record. There are just enough ship manifests to make it worth your time to at least look, but I wouldn't spend endless hours if nothing's coming up. That doesn't mean you're up a creek, though. There are a number of sources that could be used to find out at least some of the information you'd like to know about your immigrant ancestor. There are a number of indexes available, the most useful being known as PILI, or the U.S. and Canada Passenger and Immigration List Index, 1500 to 1900. It won't provide you near as much detail as an early 20th century ship's manifest because it's an index aggregated from across a few thousand different sources, but it's a great way to kind of browse all those sources quickly. It can be found in just about any major genealogy site. Again, broadly speaking, immigrants that came from parts of the British Empire did not have to do much because they weren't really immigrating. They were just moving from one part of the empire to another. Immigrants from elsewhere, though, did sometimes have to go through a sort of naturalization or what they called denization process that was, again, quite unique to each colony. Naturalization would give the immigrant the right to fully participate in all public activities, while denization gave the immigrant access to probate processes. You can find a list of over 1,300 of these cases in Denizations and Naturalizations in the British Colonies in America, 1607 to 1775, a record collection that is available both on Ancestry.com and Family Search. It can be found elsewhere in book form as well. Church records should not be overlooked. No, in most cases, churches weren't handling immigration or naturalization issues directly, but several denominations were known for fastidious record keeping, and you might be able to find a record of new congregants where it might list that, Jonathan Hartley arrived by letter from All Saints in Maidstone. So if your ancestor was Jonathan Hartley, and you know where he lived within the colonies, and you suspect him to have been an Anglican, check to see if church records are available for Anglican churches in the area at that time. They might be kept in existing Episcopal churches, or they might be in state archives or university archives. Churches that were descendants of the Radical Reformation, like the Baptists, were not as great at record keeping, and the likelihood that the records still remain if they had been kept are low, but it's still worth the look. Newspapers are also worth a look, but again, the likelihood of information specific to your ancestor is relatively low. You might get some luck, though, and find that your ancestor advertised for transportation further inland to scope out potential land plats. Or if they were a person of means or served a useful function, the paper might have announced their arrival directly. It was very common to provide detailed information about ships arriving and departing, so if you can find what ship your ancestor came on, newspapers will be a great source of information for you. There are still other sources you can go to in order to fill in some of those gaps in knowledge about your early immigrant ancestor. You can look at published genealogies, although researcher beware. You can search for court cases where sometimes you'll see an individual mentioned in a case followed by something like recently arrived from Bristol. You might get lucky and find a local history or a journal that mentions some details about your ancestor. I've not had much luck, but I always search for any record that may have been created and kept at the port of departure, or emigration records with an E. Although, to make this one successful, you have to kind of already have a pretty good hunch of where they came from. At the end of the day, when you find that colonial ancestor, beyond whom you can't explore because the rest of the family is across the Atlantic, don't just throw up your hands and move on to the next line to investigate. Yes, this may very well become a brick wall, but don't just build one yourself until you've looked everywhere that might have something for you. I hope this has been at least a little useful for you. Even if you don't find anything on your specific ancestor, I think spending some time in these sources is useful, simply to see what's there and how is it organized and structured. This just again helps you add tools to your toolkit, and you can never have too many tools. Do you have an interesting colonial immigrant in your family tree? I'd love to hear about them. Please reach out to me on Twitter @thewgtpod. If you found something useful in today's episode, think about leaving a review. Either way, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Next week, I want to continue talking about immigration and bring us into the next big wave into the United States, and get into some of the different sources that can really help us with those more recent immigrants. I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you then.